Cost Accounting, Chapter 3. So much like Chapters 1 and 2, Chapter 3 is mostly vocabulary for cost accounting. This will cover a lot of the information that we covered in Principles of Accounting 2. So it's a review of all of the vocabulary that we use in cost management accounting. So a cost is anytime we use a resource for some purpose. So when we're in this class, we're talking about resources for the use of business purposes. We assemble those costs into groups that we call cost pools. Those cost pools might be product costs, selling costs, administrative costs, etc. So we have the type of cost or the source of the cost are ways that we can separate into cost pools. Any factor that drives that cost is called a cost driver. So for example, in a product cost, we might have the assembly of that cost. So our assembly wages or our machine hours is the cost driver for that particular cost. A cost object is anything that we want cost information for. So every individual project we have is a cost object. Or if we're a service organization, then each of our services is a cost object. We want to collect cost information for an individual object so we can make decisions about how to sell it, how much money to charge for it, etc. So cost assignment is when we go about assigning our cost to cost pools, and then from those cost pools to our individual cost objects. We have two types of costs, direct costs and indirect costs. If you remember from Principles of Accounting 2, we get into even more cost classifications definitions, and we will throughout this chapter also. So direct costs are those that can be conveniently and economically traced to a cost pool or a cost object. Remember, that means that it doesn't cost more money to trace the cost to the cost object than what the actual cost is. Indirect costs cannot be traced conveniently or economically to a cost pool or a cost object. Indirect costs end up in our overhead pool. So these are all of the costs that we can't easily say were part of a product or service cost. And cost allocation is when we take these overhead costs and we assign them to cost pools and then to our cost object through the use of our cost drivers, which is our allocation base for overhead. So we start with our resource costs. So this is just an example of some resource costs for a plant. We have assembly of a product and then packaging of a product. The electric motor is a direct material. Materials handling is that cost of getting the material from our supplier to the assembly line. Supervision is our project supervisor. Then we have packing materials, labels, and we have our final inspection. We separate our amounts out into cost pools. So the electric motor goes straight to assembly. Materials handling and supervision get divided between assembly and packing. Packing materials goes just to packing, and the final inspection goes straight to the two cost objects. Once we've separated into cost pools, then we apply those costs to those two cost objects. In this case, we make dishwashers and washing machines. Direct material costs are those materials that are easily traced to the product. We have the purchase price of the materials plus freight minus any purchase discounts and reasonable allowance for scrap and defective units. Indirect material costs are those materials that cannot be readily traced to outputs. You might have lubricants, small tools, screws, nails, cleaning rags for maintenance, how much soap we get out of a soap bucket for our cleaning supplies. Those things end up as an indirect cost. All of our indirect costs pool into overhead. Direct labor costs, again, can be easily traced to our product, and indirect labor costs are support costs, our supervision, quality control, inspection, maintenance, all end up in overhead. All of our indirect costs, as I've already said, end up as overhead. Overhead can also be called factory overhead or indirect manufacturing costs. So the three main types of costs that we have are direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. We can divide those further into prime costs and conversion costs. Direct labor is both a prime cost and a conversion cost. Conversion costs are the cost that it takes to convert prime materials to a finished product. So we convert direct materials and direct labor into a finished product. And in order to do that, we use direct labor and overhead. Direct labor is both a prime cost and a conversion cost.